All right, we are now at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. This is the second presentation of this workshop. This workshop is part of the city's effort to develop a climate action plan. Thank you everyone for being here. As a couple of little notes, this is a process that will be continuing on over the next several months of us gathering public input. So there will be other opportunities for you to weigh in and provide comments. In addition, today, we are going to go through the presentation. We'll have opportunities along the way for question, answers, discussion. And then following the presentation, we will actually be posting on the website some follow-up questions that you all can respond to, but that will also be there along with a link to the recorded version of this workshop so that anyone who is unable to attend and watch live will be able to then have the same opportunity to provide feedback based on what they see in the recording. So with that, I see that we've got a couple of people still that have signed in. I wanted to thank you all again for being here and being part of this process. My name is Susan Elliott, and I am the city's Climate Protection Program Manager. And with that, we will go ahead and I'll start moving through our slide deck. Okay, so for today, we've broken the agenda out into the 4 pieces. We will go over each of the sections in a space of about 30 minutes. We're doing the time points on this so that if people are unable to join for the full 2 hours, but they are interested in a certain topic, they can then go ahead and hopefully sign in when that topic will be under discussion. Similarly, since the recording will be posted online, we wanted to put the time points out there so that it would be easy for people to jump ahead into the video and listen in on the pieces that they are most interested in. Over the course of today, we'll talk through, in this first section, an introduction overview of the plan development process for Charlottesville's Climate Action Plan. We'll go over some of Charlottesville's emissions and where we're starting from in terms of what we have left to achieve. And we'll talk about some example climate action strategies. Following that, at 30 minutes into the presentation, we will then switch over to talking about stationary sources of emissions. Stationary sources, largely what you will end up seeing in the data is the majority of Charlottesville stationary sources are actually coming from our residential and our commercial sector. Then at an hour into the presentation, we'll talk about renewables and on-site renewables, but a larger question of just bringing renewables into our power sources. And then for the last 30 minutes, we'll transition to talking about transportation. Excuse me. One of the things I also wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of is that we do have a web page set up on the city's website that is dedicated to this climate action planning process. The URL for that is charlottesville.gov/climateplan. That is where we will post the webinar, this workshop recording. We will also have additional informational materials posted there, notifications about future events. And also there is a link to a contact form. So if you have feedback you'd like to provide on the process or on the plan that you either don't have an opportunity today or any of the future opportunities don't align with when you want to send that in, we do have an available option for you to reach out to us. Lastly, I also wanted to encourage you to sign up to get push notifications for the climate action news flashes. You can sign up for these with the URL that you see on the screen, or you can go to charlottesville.gov/notify-me. And on there will be a list. You can go ahead and put either your email address or your text phone number in on there and sign up for whichever topics that you would like to get notices of when some sort of an alert or a news release gets published for those. As we add things to the climate plan webpage, we will also be putting out news flashes to let people know that there's new materials available. All right, and with that, I'll go ahead and move on into our first part of our discussion today. So talking about the plan development process. As background for this, Charlottesville actually started its climate protection program back in 2007. There have been different commitments and efforts that the city has been involved in since then. One of the more recent ones is the 2017 commitment to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. This commitment laid out several actions that the city is working through achieving. They are split into two different tracks. One, which is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions that the city is putting out there. And when I say the city in that context, I mean community-wide within the city. Additionally, it is then looking at adaptation to climate change and what we are, how is the community preparing to then be able to respond and adapt to the different effects that we're going to see coming our way. For today and this climate action plan development process, this is focused per the Global Covenant of Mayors on developing a plan to achieve the greenhouse gas reduction goal that Council adopted in 2018. That reduction goal is a 45% emissions reduction by 2030, and then reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Additionally, in 2019, City Council provided direction of other things that they wanted to make sure were represented in our climate action plan. Many of these items were also things that we were hearing from the community, and so passing this resolution was a way for the city to reflect back to the community that what their comments, the comments they had submitted were being heard, but also to provide an underlying framework for what the climate action plan needed to be able to incorporate. That is what the text from that resolution is what's being shown on the screen right now. Includes wanting to front load our reductions, so getting our greenhouse gas reductions earlier, not waiting until the final hour to try to get them all in, identifying sub-goals by sector and strategy, addressing equity specifically throughout the climate action plan, identifying measurement frequency and accountability mechanisms that we can incorporate, looking at funding and financing options to support and enable action in the private sector, addressing the feasibility of integrating zero emission vehicles, both in the community and in our municipal fleet, and working in conjunction with our regional partners so that we can implement seamless programs and services. And that last point, I'll paraphrase it to really say that one of the things we've heard from our community members is that as they go about their daily lives, they're moving across jurisdictions. And so they want to be able to see and not really have to worry about which locality they happen to be standing in that moment. They want to see consistent messaging and consistent policies that are working as a region, because really we do operate economically and in our everyday lives as a region as a whole. For developing the climate action plan, we're going to structure the content of the plan by borrowing from a strategic plan framework. We selected this because it is an action-focused way of framing our plan. It keeps our goals front and center, so we can focus on achieving our goals for 2030 while still maintaining an eye on what we need to get in place to achieve the 2050 goals. It also is a built-in process for iterative updates. And that will provide us flexibility to accommodate future changes, both in terms of as we are making reductions and we see how that is playing out in our community, but also to incorporate new technologies or new funding options that have come onto the landscape. In developing our plan, we're going to be building on existing efforts that have occurred. We heard a lot of people not wanting us to remake the wheel. And as I said, Charlottesville did start its climate protection program back in 2007. So there have been a number of efforts that we within the city have done. Additionally, the University of Virginia and Albemarle County have both made plans and commitments around reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. And we have localities across the country that we can look to see what they've put together. And lastly, just reiterating, we're looking to bring in a regional perspective. There are a lot of different processes where we are working regionally, where we are planning regionally and looking at making investments regionally. And we want to make sure that we are working and thinking about developing our plan in that context and looking at how those processes can aid us as a community moving forward in achieving our greenhouse gas reduction goals. For receiving input from the community, this is a big piece, as you'll see coming up. The vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions are from community activities. So we need to make sure that this plan works for our community members to be able to take action and have a pathway before them that they feel is achievable. We had originally planned on starting our climate action plan process back in the spring of 2020, but due to COVID, we've had to push that back and have a delayed start on that. We will be overlapping our climate plan greenhouse gas reduction process, overlapping a little bit with the adaptation process. And we're going to be structuring into these ways for those two pieces to speak to each other. In terms of gathering community input on this piece of the process, we're pursuing a layered community engagement approach. So we'll have opportunities for community members to participate and provide input. That will be things like today's workshop. There'll be other online surveys or questionnaires for people to provide feedback, and then opportunities for drafts, for reviews and comment periods. In addition to that, we're going to be holding several small group discussions with specific stakeholder groups that have specific topic expertise. We're going to be forming core topic teams comprised of city staff, institutional partners, and members of the public that serve on city committees, commissions, and advisory boards. There'll be a climate action plan liaison committee, which is going to be comprised of executives and program leads from the city and its regional planning partners. And also throughout this process, we want to have an equity focus. So there will be some direct outreach to specific stakeholder groups. In addition to that, we're going to be doing an equity workshop in January, and then hopefully out of those two pieces, we'll have some volunteers who will be willing to work with us as an actual work group to dive in deeper on the climate action plan strategies and identify where equity implications are coming in, and looking at not just the specific emission reduction action, but how we design that implementation, how we then measure the performance and those accountability aspects of our plan to make sure that we're bringing equity into those as well. And then separately from this layered approach for community engagement, which is directly being focused on informing our climate action plan, we also realize there are other efforts happening in the community that relate to this topic. And so we want to make sure we are building and incorporating those as well. A couple of examples of what those would be is there's a climate justice mapping project that's being led by the UVA Equity Center. The city is developing and has a draft housing plan. It's updating its comprehensive plan, and we'll be doing a zoning update. There is a landfill diversion study that the city has underway right now, and it's looking at both how we can divert materials, such as organic materials, away from the landfill, but really how can we improve the quality of waste services that the city offers to its community. There is additionally training that we're going through to be able to better assess the forestry land use that is within the city. We're working on that with UVA and the county as well. And so that will be a new addition of data that we have not previously been able to incorporate into our greenhouse gas emission profile. In terms of how we're structuring which topics and those focuses of discussion within our plan process, what you see on the right is our 2016 greenhouse gas profile. The key highlights that you can see popping out of there is that the majority of the emissions that are coming from our community are coming from three sectors: our residential sector, our commercial sector, and our community transportation sector. Because of that, if we're looking at where can we reduce our emissions, those are the three places where we have the most opportunity to really make reductions. And so because of that, we are sequencing the order in which we are discussing topics for our plan, and we are focusing on those three sectors first. So buildings, on-site renewables, transportation. And then going into early 2021, can't believe it's already almost 2021, we will then also be bringing in topics around the other sectors. So waste, looking at sequestration and drawdown, options for energy sourcing, things around the landscape and the natural environment that help with emission reductions, but also cooling and the amount of energy that's needed for our other buildings and energy uses around town. In addition, we are trying to bring equity in throughout the process and trying to also to keep an eye on options around the financing topic, understanding what funding and financing options are available and what the needs are, where there might be gaps in terms of what is currently available for Charlottesville, but what may be very needed in order for action to move forward in these areas. So next, I'm going to talk about Charlottesville's greenhouse gas emissions. I thought it would be useful to start off with explaining the kind of basic underlying calculation method. The city, as part of the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, there is a specific reporting protocol that we follow to compile our greenhouse gas emission inventories. This is one that is used for communities across the country and across the world. And it's a standard set that indicates what type of data we should be reporting on. And it also lays out things that are optional, that if that data is available for a community, it provides the pathway for how we can incorporate that, but it's not necessarily required. But there are core required pieces. Underlying all of this is this basic equation of you have your activity data, you multiply by your carbon intensity of how intense the carbon usage is for that activity, and that produces what your greenhouse gas emissions are. What this looks like is, in terms of the activity data, it's looking at what kind of quantity of things are being used. So how much electricity use is there? What is the vehicle miles that traveled by gasoline or diesel vehicles? How many tons of waste are being sent to the landfill? And then it looks at what the carbon intensity is of that. So it's the carbon dioxide equivalent per unit. So what is the carbon intensity of electricity? That goes back to, well, what are the fuel sources that are being used to generate that electricity? Vehicle miles traveled relates to what's the fuel source you're using and how efficient is that vehicle. Tons of waste, it goes to how much organics are you sending into the landfill rather than processing in a way that produces less of greenhouse gas emissions. These two pieces combined end up adding up to saying this is the amount of carbon dioxide that we as a community are releasing into the air. And looking at where Charlottesville is with this, we can see from 2000 to 2011 to 2016 is that we've seen an increasing rate of reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. We've also seen that as of 2016, we're almost halfway to reaching our 2030 goal of a total of 45% emission reduction. And again, this is that same pie chart. It's a little bit bigger on the slide that I showed you a minute ago. But this is where we were in 2016. And so looking ahead at where we have that opportunity to get that remaining 24% of emissions, really the most opportunity for that is going to need efforts in our residential, commercial, and transportation sectors. As we're looking at this to reduce, one thing I did want to put out there is that the two pieces on the left are what we're putting up into the air. So if we can have actions that reduce those, we're reducing what we put up in the air. Once we have the emissions on the air, when you're looking at the right-hand side of that equation, that's those purple boxes, there are strategies that can remove emissions from the air. But the more reductions of emissions we can do on the left side of this equation means the less work we have to do after the fact to then pull the carbon out. And the type of actions that relate to each of these three parts of the equation are reducing the induced demand. So not just reducing the need for whatever that activity is. There is the increasing the efficiency of equipment that you're using for achieving something. So you don't need to use as much fuel to achieve the same end result. And then there's conservation behaviors and choices that we make on a day in, day out basis. Over on carbon intensity, the actions on this, these two seem to work in a gradation and work in tandem. So you can switch to just using a different fuel source that is lower carbon intensity, or you can switch to something that is carbon-free, that's a renewable. And the way these tend to work together is a transition of switching to a lower carbon fuel, such as electricity that is provided by the grid, and then looking at, well, how can you make that electricity to be generated by a renewable source that's carbon-free? Once we're over on the right-hand side of the equation, what we're looking at is sequestration or drawdown, looking at carbon farming or carbon capture and sequestration. One example that I think most people are familiar with is the idea that plants and trees breathe in carbon dioxide and then breathe out oxygen. That is one form of sequestration. But there's a lot of other technologies that are going into this space to try to bring down what we've already put out into the air. And there's a lot of other markets around things such as carbon farming that are developing, but are not quite commonplace yet. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause. We have about 9 minutes until we need to move on to our next section. I'm going to open up for questions, and in doing that, we have Lasheen Parks from the city's communications office, who will be assisting with getting the question and the answer periods.
Hi everyone, my name is Lasheen Parks and I work in the communications department as the social media and marketing coordinator, and today I'm going to help facilitate the Q&A portion of this webinar. So if you do have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I will bring you in and you'll be able to ask your question. So first up we have Caetano. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but you can correct me when I bring you in. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Amazing. So it's Caetano. Nice to meet you. Hi, Susan. Thank you for doing this presentation. Very timely. I just have a question regarding measurements moving forward. How the city is going to track the performance in greenhouse gas reductions. As you mentioned, the city has achieved great reductions since 2012, placing the city apparently in the correct path for meeting the first goal of 45% reduction. But my question is how is the city planning to differentiate what reductions is being achieved by city-led actions and what reductions are being achieved by state or federal actions in a way that Charlottesville can differentiate itself, its performance from the performance of any other municipality in the state that actually does not have any climate action plan or climate targets. How the city can confirm leadership, if possible.
Sure, that's yeah. There's a lot of pieces in that question. Thank you for asking that. One of the things that I'm going to try to repeat your question back just so that there are subtitles on the screen for if anyone is watching the recording. And so in terms of the question of how the city is going to be tracking its reductions, I think you're specifically asking about how the city will be able to attribute results of its own actions versus things that are more incidental, that we are in a bigger context. And so changes are differentiating, is it changes that are happening here versus it's changes that are happening around us that we're just receiving the benefits of. So one of the pieces with that, we can see some of that in the greenhouse gas inventory data, which, by the way, we are going to be having releasing a interactive data dashboard that will be embedded on the city's website that will allow people more access into the actual data that's behind the inventory. And then as we add more inventory years, it'll auto flow into that, which we hope will then speed up that process, but also allow people to be able to dive into the data and do their own explorations. What we saw in that when we were looking at our 2016 data is it goes back to that equation of, were we seeing reductions in terms of that activity data? Were we seeing reductions in terms of the carbon intensity aspects? Specifically, when we were looking at the the emissions that were coming from electricity, during that time period, Dominion Power, which is the only electric utility that serves the city of Charlottesville jurisdiction, they had changed the fuel source and they had stopped using as much coal to generate their electricity and had started using more natural gas, which is a less carbon intensive fuel. By doing that, it meant that for every kilowatt hour that anybody in the city of Charlottesville used, there were less emissions that were being produced. But when we looked at the data, we saw that there were reductions on both the activity side and also on that carbon intensity side. And so that's one way that we would be able to attribute, is it local action or is it something that's a different entity's decision? Specifically in your question, you asked about state and federal action. And that's an interesting question because the different layers of government tend to focus on moving public policy in different directions or in different ways, but hopefully it ends up being a layered sort of symbiotic relationship across the three. So as an example, this past General Assembly session, Virginia was able to join something called the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a carbon cap and trade program, and will be producing annual funding revenues that the Commonwealth is going to be directing towards energy efficiency efforts. So in one way you could say anything that comes out of achievements from that funding could be attributed to the state. At the same time, if that funding is being given to a broader geographic area that Charlottesville is within, if we are then taking extra action to help connect our residents to that funding source, that could be pointed to as a local achievement. Additionally, if we have local funds or other efforts and resources that we're layering on that to make this connection, suddenly the metrics that you're getting out can be attributed in multiple directions. And so it becomes a little bit less clear of how exactly you're going to be able to attribute responsibility for those achievements. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at the data, we should be able to see at least where there are changes locally versus changes in the carbon intensity. And any of those changes locally would need to have local participants agreeing and wanting to be part of that process. And then beyond that, I think this climate action plan process is if there are measurements that maybe are not indicators that fit into the greenhouse gas inventory, but are things that we can track at a more granular level that are indicators, we have the opportunity to identify those and bring them into something that is part of a regular reporting structure.
So the next person that raised their hand is Leslie Four. So I'm going to bring her in now. Leslie, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Susan, I raised my hand right after Caetano asked his questions, and I think you may have answered it. But looking at the greenhouse gas inventory between 2011 and 2016, we see that positive reduction. And I'm interested, so you can verify that Dominion changed, the plant from which the energy was being produced from coal to natural gas, and that had a lot to do with the reduction in carbon intensity. But am I hearing you correctly, and you don't know exactly what activities went into that reduction, and that going forward as part of the climate action plan, you hope to be able to track what activities contributed to reduction?
Yep, so that's a good question. So in the reductions that we saw from 2011 to 2016, anything, let me actually move this slide back. Anything that is in this carbon intensity side that went down related to electricity, that would be resulting from Dominion changing how they are generating their electricity. Anything that we saw on this activity side, so the amount of electricity actually consumed by our locality, that is the activity data. And so where we can see in the data is, did we start consuming more electricity or less electricity? Where we need to step outside of data that the greenhouse gas inventory provides is to then look at, well, what may have caused those decreases in electricity consumption? Some of that could be installing on-site solar systems because the properties would then be using the electricity from their solar system, not from Dominion. And so we would not let the amount of data we have then electricity use that's purchased from Dominion would have gone down. Similarly, if you're doing energy efficiency, and so buildings just don't need to use as much electricity, that would be part of it. One of the things that we saw related to the transportation sector is we saw the result of increased fuel economy standards over that time period as well. So that's another where we can see the vehicle miles traveled, which gives us a sense of like the actual actions of how much driving and vehicle usage is there in our locality. But then again, when we're looking at what that carbon intensity was, how that translated through, the more efficient the vehicles were, the less that we were then seeing in the resulting carbon emissions. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, it does. So, so this is sort of, it does. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, so if we want to kind of dig in more to the question of what specific actions are happening on the ground that are then producing these emission reductions,
Right.
we need to look for data that is not part of the greenhouse gas inventory. So that could be looking at like programs like LEAP, the Local Energy Alliance program,
Right.
and looking at how many retrofits they've done.
Gotcha.
It could be looking at any other big redevelopment projects that are happening and seeing what's going on in that space. You know, how many properties in the city were built to certain green building standards, for example.
Sure. And I think I heard you say that, you know, whatever allocations come out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, those activities will be tied to funding and will therefore be easier to track. It's always easier if there's money attached, right?
Yeah, usually, well, it depends on who is providing that funding. So for example, if Dominion is funding a demand response program, that would be making changes in properties to reduce the energy use for those. Dominion, in theory, would get all the program data of what the energy reductions were. How much of that data then becomes shared with the public would probably be based on commitments that they made when they designed the program and in speaking to SCC. So I'm not sure exactly how much of the data will from the RGGI funding, which metrics are going to be public. But in theory, I would assume we would be able to know, you know, how many projects were done in Charlottesville, or I would hope that there's there will be some sort of a basis of like, if you're going to do a project, you know, it needs to meet these sort of certain set of standards. And I'll talk a little bit more about the RGGI piece in the next section on stationary emissions, because it's an interesting piece and it is evolving. It's the terms for how the RGGI proceeds will be used are not yet finalized.
If anyone else has a question at this time, go ahead and raise your hand, but there will be other opportunities throughout this presentation to ask a question. So we have Travis that has a question. Travis,
Thank
can
you.
hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute there. First, I want to thank city staff for getting this important effort going. I just had one question. I know greenhouse gas emissions are definitely the priority of this effort, but a lot of the strategies here will also have important co-benefits in other areas. I just wanted to know if you all also plan to track some of those other co-benefits that may result from this process and kind of present them alongside the greenhouse gas reduction figures.
Yeah, so the question in your point about that this process is aimed at making sure we can achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals. But you are absolutely right. There are other benefits that come along with those strategies. In terms of tracking those, I think that is one of the things that I would like to be able to do. And there's opportunity in this process to be able to identify which ones are the biggest priority for us as a community to track. And then also try to identify, well, what are the indicators or metrics that we actually have access to be able to do that. There are things that, you know, logically we can see and know affect greenhouse gas emissions, you know, up different supply chains or activities that we have here that we may not be able to get data on. And so for any of those sort of aspects, I think there is space within the climate action plan to include them. And we would just need to be clear in noting which of those are things that we can speak to in our inventory and which things are running in parallel to that. Going back to the co-benefits, I think one of the other opportunities that we have is in looking at, as we design and choose not just the specific actions to reduce emissions that we want to target and really try to push forward, but how do we want to deliver those? And that's where I think that point around co-benefits adds a lot of context and brings in a lot of the values of what and how can we make this plan framed best to suit Charlottesville and what Charlottesville's needs and values are.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I would also ask you to, when you do provide any other feedback or written like responses to the workshop, if there are specific co-benefits that you have in mind that you do want to draw our attention to, please do mention those so that we can make sure they're on our radar.
So Susan, it doesn't look like anyone else has raised their hand. If you want to go ahead and continue.
Excellent. All right. Then just get the light off the screen. All right, so then we are a couple of minutes after the 30-minute point, but in case anybody has joined us specifically to join us for the stationary source emissions topic, I wanted to put this agenda back up. We're going to switch into that, and then following this, we'll switch over to renewable energy and then transportation. Additionally, if you have just joined us, we have a webpage set up on the city's website, charlottesville.gov/climate-plan, where we will be posting the recording for the workshop, other informational materials, both related to the workshop and other resources, details on future events, and there's a contact form as well. And I do encourage everybody to sign up for the climate action news flashes. As we put information on the website, we will be pushing out notices through the newsflash Notify Me function. And so through Notify Me, which you can access either via the URL on the screen right now or at charlottesville.gov/notify-me, you can sign up and get either email or text alerts that will let you know when we've put out something new. Right, moving into stationary emission sources. So what are stationary sources? This term, the first time people hear it, tends to always seem a little bit weird. It was for me at least. And so stationary sources are activities that produce greenhouse gas emissions that are connected to a single location that is not mobile. So for example, like the emissions that are associated with buildings or with streetlights. In the greenhouse gas emissions profile, what the sectors are that are stationary sources are residential, commercial, municipal government, non-municipal government, and industry. When we look at Charlottesville's emissions specifically, what we can see, and this is that same pie chart from 2016 I showed earlier in the workshop, our residential and our commercial sector are both our largest sources of stationary emissions. Community transport is a mobile source, so that is not a stationary one. But it is one of the big three that we have in terms of emission producers within our profile. Our municipal government, so all of the city and school buildings and all of the street lights and other outdoor trail lighting that the city has, accounts for just under 3% of that overall pie chart. And then non-municipal government, that would be like the Albemarle County office buildings, the federal courthouse building, and any other sort of state offices or other local government type authorities that have offices and energy use within the city boundaries. Charlottesville does not have a lot of industry. It's a very small little percent there, but they do have a little tiny piece of our emissions pie. So in looking at how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions on stationary sources, this is that same equation that I showed you before for how you calculate greenhouse gas emissions. And what we see in that pie chart is a reflection of these two pieces on the left. So it's the activity data and then the carbon intensity. And looking at, well, what are types of examples? So reducing that induced demand when you're looking at stationary sources. What that is looking at is really getting at the question of how much energy is even needed to do something like heat and cool your building. So emission reduction strategies are, for example, that would be looking at your insulation and your air sealing. This is one of the strategies that also has additional benefits in terms of just better indoor comfort in terms of your climate control, but looking at times when the power goes out, how well your building is insulated and air sealed goes to how long it retains a comfortable temperature before you then need to either find some other recourse. So for example, how long can it maintain that comfortable temperature before you need your heating or your air conditioning to come back on again? When you're looking at your equipment efficiency, that speaks to how much energy your equipment needs to perform the same task. Some examples of this would be, having baseboard electric heating versus an air pump. Looking at, if you're looking between different HVAC units, the different efficiency levels of those, looking at your hot water heaters, or even within your light bulb, looking at how much energy does an LED bulb need versus a CFL or incandescent. And as referenced, like LEDs use significantly less energy. So that, like, swapping out those equipment choices, you're reducing that amount of activity data in terms of how much energy you need to accomplish that same end goal. In terms of conservation behaviors, some of these are choices that we would be making day in, day out, like making sure to turn off items when they're not in use. It can also speak to things like getting programmable thermostats that then automatically are adjusting the temperature and the amount of energy that's being used around the schedule that makes sense for you. When we're looking at the carbon intensity side of the equation for stationary sources, we will be talking more about renewables, so I'm not going to speak much about them right now. But it's looking at switching to a lower carbon fuel. An example out of the mobile sources that people are pretty familiar with, I think, is the idea that if you can switch from using gasoline or diesel to using electricity, there's less carbon embedded in that. And it's the same concept when you're looking at your stationary sources. So looking at going to something that's a lower carbon fuel. The vast majority of emissions from our stationary sources in Charlottesville come from electricity and natural gas use. There are some residences, though, that use propane, fuel oil, or wood as their primary heating source for their homes. Those are more carbon intense fuel sources than if they were able to switch over to electricity or natural gas, for example. So the next slide, this one is where we tried to put together three different scenarios to get a sense of the breadth and kind of scale and pace of action that we would need to see in Charlottesville in order to meet our 2030 goals. What you see in here, those first four green rows, these are very, very high level roll-ups of looking at emission reduction potential, or actually targets for emission reduction out of four types of strategies that all focus on those three big sectors of residential, commercial, and community transport. In developing these scenarios, these are not proposals. These were really just a practice in trying to put some numbers down to see what does it really mean in terms of emission reductions to get to our 2030 goal, and how do the levers between these strategies play out. These were developed primarily thinking about the energy efficiency and the renewables, two levers, so that the two left sides of that equation around stationary source emissions. The transportation emissions were put in, but there's not a lot of modeling that goes behind that. And that was a question we got at the workshop presentation last night, was asking about, that 5% for transportation, how much was that something that we really thought that was where we were going to be able to go or not? I think that was more put in there as a recognition of some sort of activity should be happening on the community transport side. And there's a lot of opportunities in this process to dive into that deeper and figure out, well, what is that correct target that we should be aiming for out of our transportation piece? So in looking at the scenarios, the pieces in the red boxes, those are the parts that relate to this energy efficiency retrofit piece. So scenario one is looking at if we were going to see a 10% reduction in energy or emissions out of our residential and commercial buildings, and if that 10% reduction was achieved by a fifth of all buildings in the city, which would be approximately 2,500 buildings, that breaks out over the next 8 to 9 years of being approximately 300 buildings a year that would need to have those retrofits and $1.3 million of investment each year for that. In scenario 2, we looked at, well, what if it was a 20% reduction that was achieved in a quarter of the buildings? And then for scenario 3, we've put this in really as a wild card of saying, well, what if no energy efficiency was able to be achieved, no reductions on transportation were able to be achieved? What would that mean in terms of renewables? You'll see the third line in each of these scenarios is grid reductions. Dominion is committed as of this last 2020 General Assembly session to achieve a 30% emissions reduction in the electricity it provides for us by 2030. So that's where that 30% number came in across the board. In these models, there are some big assumptions. Some of those are listed there on the right. One of the big ones is a presumption that all buildings in Charlottesville use the same amount of electricity and natural gas. The cost estimates on this were based on retrofit costs for a small to medium-sized house. Anything that is listed in terms of on-site renewables is based on assuming that the largest solar PV systems get installed first, and then we work our way down to smaller systems throughout the based on footprint size and of the available rooftops. And the PV costs for that were based on recent solar ice campaigns in terms of what the cost for that solar would be. Really, I think the big takeaway for me, at least, in seeing how these scenarios played through was starting to look at how many properties, meaning how many property owners and occupants would need to be actually participating in having these retrofits move forward, and also starting to look at what type of scale of funding is needed for these. One of the reasons why the Climate Action Plan is directed to address funding and financing options is because we cannot fund this level of investment at this scale and pacing based on just local government tax incentives or rebates. There needs to be funding and identification of what that looks like from other sources. There are certain funding sources that do help align this, where it's more paying out of the energy savings, so it's not necessarily all new investment that's needed, but there is a significant level of investment and activity on our actual building structures that is needed to reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Some other strategy considerations that come into play when we're looking at how do we then design or direct what these strategies are to achieve these actions. Current funding and potential funding routes is one. Looking at what happens with new housing and new construction. What we are seeing in our pie chart right now of our emission reductions is based on existing structures and existing buildings. So as we're looking at new developments coming in, how are those going to be built to what energy standard, and what does that play through in regards to how it's affecting our emissions? Additionally, looking at proactively doing retrofits versus if a piece of equipment such as an HVAC or a water heater fails and needs to be replaced, at that point there's a set of investment that's already presumed to be needed to replace that equipment. So how can we use that opportunity to get something that's more efficient installed? In terms of just how do we direct our policy priorities, how do we define what those are? Do we prefer to look at a small number of bigger buildings where there might be fewer individuals that need to make the agreement to go ahead and make those retrofits, but it affects all of the occupants within that building? Or are we trying to aim our policies towards supporting a large number of actions in smaller buildings? In which case there's more individual property owners, potentially more individual homes that are being brought in and needing to participate and have these actions taken. Charlottesville has a 60% rental rate. And so this idea of the split incentive, where the individuals who are receiving the benefits of these energy improvements, both in terms of the costs that they are then saving on their utility bills, but also that quality of life comfort of just how comfortable their home is. They are not the same people as those who own the properties and who would need to be making that investment decision to make those upgrades on the property itself. And so a question of how do we align that? How do we make that the strategies and the programs that we're putting forward, how do we make those work for all of those, for both groups on that side? Going back to funding, looking at that lifetime savings versus the upfront cost. For many of the type of emission reduction actions, it does end up paying for itself over the lifetime of that, whatever equipment or pieces thing got installed. But being able to pay for that upfront can be a challenge in a lot of ways as well. And so are there certain funding structures, or are there certain programs that we can look at bringing resources into the community that help to meet and pair that up better? Additionally, going back over to the question earlier about like, what are these other co-benefits? Looking at, well, where does resilience and adaptation come in? What are these other quality of life benefits? So looking at that air sealing and insulation example, there's the economic savings that come from the energy costs, reducing what that energy burden is for that household. There's the general kind of social greater indoor comfort aspect of having an improved property in terms of how its energy performance is. There's that resilience aspect of how long can they shelter in space when the grid goes out before they then need to go someplace else to find heat or cool in the summer. And then there's just also some, kind of practical pieces that cut across those areas of, if your HVAC isn't turning on and off constantly, it functions better and then it can last longer over time, which stretches out that point till the next replacement. And so there's a lot of these different pieces that are at play when we look at how are we delivering and designing what we want for our plan and how we want to deliver and move these actions forward. In terms of funding, there are certain ongoing funding programs that already are in operation here. Some of these are provided by the city. Some of them are by utilities or are funded through other levels of government, and that are then passed down to individual providers to move forward. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is one that we spoke about in the first part of this workshop. And it's exciting because it is a significant level of new funding in this area that is coming into the Commonwealth. The Department of Housing and Community Development is responsible for determining how those funds get distributed. And they are, actually there's a session this afternoon where they are announcing what that upcoming process is going to be with stakeholder engagement to refine and develop what those guidelines are for how that funding will be moving forward. Energy efficiency is definitely within the scope of that. And I've heard others are interested in trying to work with DHCD to also include concepts around solar or solar ready or energy storage ready. But all of that is still a little bit TBD right now because the guidelines have not been developed. Other potential sources are looking at commercial PACE, which helps to address that upfront cost challenge, as well as the split incentive issue between property owner and occupant, whether it is a apartment, sort of like a resident occupant in an apartment, or whether it is a small business that is renting a space. There are also other things that we have not looked at in Charlottesville before, of environmental bonds, emerging market of environmental, social, and governance investing. And then also the city is updating its zoning. And so there may be some opportunities of things we can incorporate into that. For you all, over the course of our plan development, but also today, some questions that also play in to the background context of all of this is the underlying piece of, as we're looking at these greenhouse gas emission actions, what's needed to make them actionable here in Charlottesville? What specific barriers need to be addressed that can either make them more affordable or more accessible or just more able to be done? How do we make our plan equitable? And then with each of those, are we targeting something around policy? Are we targeting engagement and education needs? Is it a funding need? Is it something around regulation or workforce needs, or something completely different beyond that? And so with that, I would like to hand it back over to Lasheen to open up our discussion and question and answer piece.
Hey, you guys. So if you have a question, go ahead and hit the raise your hand button, and I will call you in the order in which the hands go up. So first up, we have Robin Hoffman. Robin, can
Hi,
you?
guys. Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It is exactly what I've been thinking about, and it's very timely, I think. But also, my question was, when you do presentations, especially to, I guess, entrepreneurs now, I mean, I always hear that there is a burden. I really wanted to address the fact that if we look at numbers of investment, for instance, for businesses and the lower the utility costs, can we deliver that summation, so to speak? Like, for instance, is it going to cost us $1 billion to retrofit every single house? And then who would benefit from that investment? Would it be the solar company and that sort of thing? I mean, as I just wish that I would see numbers. This way people would be willing to invest. Okay, that's my question.
Thank you for that. In terms of that question of, really like if we're looking at this investment and then being able to connect the investment to who's receiving that benefit. At this point, in terms of trying to get that overarching umbrella question of what is the level of investment that's needed, that is really what we have on this slide is our first attempt really at trying to put out a range of what type of level and scale of investment we think is needed. And one of the things I would say that even though the boxes right here are around the different pieces of the energy efficiency, the scenarios are a combination of on-site renewables and energy efficiency. So it's really a combined look at these numbers together. Once you get into talking about individual properties, who's receiving that benefit, a lot of that goes into what are the specific measures that are being installed. So if you're doing things that are improving that energy efficiency and reducing the energy bills for the occupants of that space, typically the occupants are the individuals who have that utility account. So they would then be receiving that financial benefit. And that is something that can be modeled, and service providers should be able to help with that. If you're looking at something that's a larger scale piece like energy savings performance contract or commercial PACE, those project profiles will calculate through what that level of energy savings is, both in terms of the energy, but also what those cost implications are and how those costs will either be repaid to whoever the lender is or split between the property owner and that energy savings performance company. Does that get at what you were asking about, Robin?
More specifically, I'm involved with the hemp industry right now. So these people understand that the investment bankers understand, or people that want to partner with these businesses, the future of volume of, like for instance, if they could put, 1 million solar panels in Charlottesville, they would put, their money into the investment collectively to do that, because then they would actually, have a profit from the sales. So
Gotcha.
this is what yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that piece of it is, I'm going to click over the second bullet from the bottom, that governmental social governance investing. That sounds to me similar to the type of thing that you're talking about, of people starting to see that if they could invest in these pieces, they could end up making some sort of money back. And so if you're looking at solar power purchase agreements, there's a little bit of that model in there. But I think it's a newer space in terms of looking at how do we fund these improvements. And I think that's one of the things that we have the opportunity to explore and to better understand who then is determining the rules for those investments so that it doesn't end up being some sort of a predatory operation that's happening. But also are there ways that those programs can be, I'll use the word sculpted to best fit what our local market is?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, because most of the people my age group, I'm 64, are looking to upgrade their energy systems, of course. And then they would, in fact, buy the solar investment or whatever initially. And then if they had, purchasers who, or solar companies who would get investors and so forth. Like if you could see the numbers of people that are willing to do that, which C3 does, you go around and you find people that are ready to make the move. But I mean, if you could actually show that to somebody who has $1 billion in their pocket and can make another $1 billion in interest, I mean, I think that would be more attractive. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Well, yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that is the sort of question about, when looking at that scale of funding that's needed is what is it that would serve our community best and be things that people are open to actually using.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Leslie.
Hey, Susan, it's me again. So I'm just thinking, and I think this probably, and Robin's question made me think of this. So I think it might fall under environmental social governance investing. Pre-pandemic, I know Charlottesville was starting to see itself as sort of a tech hub, a clean energy hub. And what we see at the state level is when companies like Amazon and Microsoft come into Northern Virginia and put down their footprint, which is a pretty large carbon footprint, they try to balance that by investing in the community, putting up solar, et cetera, and so on. And I'm wondering if this is just brainstorming a little bit, and I hope I'm not too far ahead of the process, but thinking about, trying to encourage those companies to come to Charlottesville, but also having some mechanism to have them invest in the community in a way that helps the climate action plan.
Cool. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And we have seen a lot of that up in specifically Arlington with Amazon relocating there. And Amazon moved forward with a virtual power purchase agreement, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about later, and like what that actually is. And what that did was it opened up the opportunity for Arlington County to basically ride the same deal, but with a smaller portion of the contract. So by working with a company like Amazon that had such a big footprint, they were able to, I think, my understanding of it is, smaller entities that ride contracts or enter into contracts with the larger groups get the better economy of scale pricing because it's one big pricing contract. But we're able to then work, and it's not quite the same as the way that people typically think of public-private partnerships. But I think in the spirit of cooperation and working together to get better gains and efficiencies, it kind of fits that flavor of that idea of a public-private groups working together. Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about that for Charlottesville, and what type of businesses do we have here, and how can that community investment piece be brought in? And I think that might be something that we can talk with our economic development office about and see, as they are working with different businesses and communities and investment, what are the opportunities there? I would also say, like you did say, Charlottesville does have a number of renewable energy companies that are headquartered here. And so it would be an interesting piece to think through with them to see, do they see any opportunity for maybe crowdsourcing some of this investment more locally? And is there a structure for that would work?
It doesn't, oh, there's one hand that raised. Caetano.
Hi, it's me again, Caetano, with the Community Climate Collaborative. My question is regarding the new context in which we live right now, where the General Assembly just approved a number of very important climate bills earlier this year. And some of these bills, as Susan mentioned before, the RGGI, lay out a path forward for climate action, climate policies, reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the next 3 decades, pretty much. So my question is, how is Charlotte including in scenarios and in estimations these projections of what's going to be accomplished perhaps at state level in order to focus policies at the local level in a more complementary way, or perhaps focusing where the state is going to provide great part of the achievements? How can the city just add to make a transition more just, or make it more accessible, more actable for the entire community?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. We have seen a lot of stuff coming out of the state over this last year that is moving the Commonwealth in, not just in a direction that it has not necessarily moved at before, but at a pace it hasn't moved at before, and is opening up a lot of opportunity to consider things that were not on the table in previous years. In terms of how Charlottesville, specifically in our climate action plan, can respond to these changes on the landscape, one of the things that my office and I do is tracking what is happening at the state level, and then trying to, really what your heart of your question is figure out, well, what are the best ways that we can then try to bring those resources into here. Some of that is depending on what the specific type of action or thing is. So some of that is maybe programs that the city is able to engage with directly. Some of the things that the state puts out, though, really are targeted at shifting the market or shifting what the utilities are doing. And similar to utility programs can be aimed at shifting the market. And so in that case, for the city as a government, looking at trying to understand what those programs are, but who then are the individual actors that those programs are targeted towards, and trying to, make those connections. But as Charlottesville as a community, I would say it goes back to really what are the different types of programs, seeing how those evolve and how they are defined. We already talked a little bit about how with RGGI, the guidelines aren't clear yet. So we can try to participate in that stakeholder engagement process to help shape or at least put our feedback into DHCD of how to develop their guidelines. But we need to stay flexible to then see what actually comes out of those programs. And I think I would point back to the climate action plan being developed more at the idea of a strategic plan sort of framework. It does give us more of that opportunity every several years to go back and refresh and say, okay, well, what's developed? What are new things? What are opportunities that have either developed that are new that we need to take into account? Or, what were things that we thought were going to be great that weren't? And why weren't they? Is there something in that connection or some resources or something there that we can help bring that patch together?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think you nailed it. It would be great to see participation from Charlottesville, if possible, and Albemarle in helping shape state policies for the RGGI and other similar climate policies. I agree with you. That would be amazing. And my last comment, if I may, it seems it's very important, the activity portion when estimating greenhouse gas emissions, right? It's not only a matter, you can reduce emissions by, as you mentioned, changing the intensity and changing the activity. But I believe that the intensity factor, what's the intensity of the emissions in our grid, what's the intensity of the emissions that a car has, usually comes from state or federal legislation mostly, or policies. What the city can do most, in my opinion, is related with activity. As far as I can remember, I believe that although the city has reduced a lot emissions from 2012 to 2016, the activity in terms of vehicle miles traveled, kilowatt hour consumed, if I'm not wrong, they either increase for all the categories or they remain stable. So I think it's important, if possible, for us to track as often as possible what's happening with the activity, the consumption of miles traveled and kilowatt hours. I don't know if that would be something reasonable to ask, but I would love to know if you have plans for reporting on these key activities factors yearly maybe, or how often would be possible. Thank you.
Yeah, so we, and I think this is the last question that we can take, and then we need to move forward to the next section. So in terms of the greenhouse gas data, we are going to have that online interactive dashboard, and the background data behind that will be put onto the open data portal. So we can look at that. I don't off the top of my head right now remember the specific numbers that were in the 2016 profile, but one of the other things that is often looked at is the raw amount of energy or vehicle miles traveled that are done, but then also looking at in the context of per capita. So it could be that, you know, each home or each kind of individual activity is becoming more efficient. And that's another type of indicator that, you know, is something that we could end up deciding is something that has meaning to start reporting on and looking at more regularly. So, all right, so with that, we are 10 minutes after the hour. And so we're a little bit behind getting into this renewable energy section. But I do enjoy the questions that you guys, and I'm glad that this is such an engaged session. There will be more opportunities to do Q&A with this, but also other opportunities. There will be a follow-up feedback form that we'll be putting out there for providing additional information in response to this workshop. So if you have questions or comments that you're not able to ask verbally right now, please do keep note of those and let us know separately what those were. In case anybody has joined us, we do have a web page on the city's website at charlottesville.gov/climate plan, where we are posting information about this climate action plan process. That will have the workshop, other informational materials, details on future events, and a contact form, so that if there isn't a specific inlet that you want to utilize, you do have an avenue to contact us. Additionally, we are going to, as we add new information to this webpage, we will be pushing out alerts via the Newsflash system. So please sign up for that so that you can get an alert either via text or on email to let you know when we have something new that is online. And you can either do that with the URL that's on the screen or at charlottesville.gov/notify-me. All right, so moving into renewable energy. So renewable energy sources are sources of energy that remain perpetually available. In the context of climate action, when renewable energy sources are being spoken about, they are carbon-free ones is what is being focused on. These energy sources are alternatives to carbon-based fuels that are used by stationary sources, so replacements for like electricity, for example, in our buildings and streetlights, and also depending on your mobile emission source, like an electric vehicle could also be using a renewable energy source to power it. Looking back at this calculation for how we count up what our greenhouse gas emissions are, with the carbon intensity, this is where this topic is focused on. And just as a reminder, the more that we can do on our activity data and reducing the carbon intensity data, the less that we then have that other emissions are going up in the air that we somehow need to take other action to then bring them back out of the air in order to get to the carbon neutrality goal for 2050. Some examples of renewable energy for electricity, there are solar and wind generation. These can be, renewable energy systems can be installed either on site or if you don't have enough space on site, it's not a well-suited location, or as is the case for many buildings in Charlottesville, the amount of electricity that can be generated on site is less than what the total amount of electricity is that that building uses over the course of the year. In those situations, people will start to try to look at what are options for off-site. Off-site is a little bit tricky in Virginia because of different regulations, but the virtual PPA that I spoke about before that Amazon did, that Arlington County also participated in, that's an example of an offsite situation. There's also something called renewable energy credits. Those are attributes that you purchase that you can then take credit for the renewable generation. So if you buy an equal number of renewable energy credits compared to the amount of electricity that you buy from Dominion, you essentially are making your power source, your electricity, being powered by renewables. For natural gas, there is renewable natural gas. This is an emerging market. In terms of emission reductions, there's a lot of potential in that space. The challenges that have been identified, and there's a report by the Rocky Mountain Institute that did an analysis of this, looked at where the sources for renewable natural gas are located in the country, which do not tend to geographically overlap with where major population centers are. So there's a transportation of how do we get that renewable natural gas from those locations to where it needs to go. Additionally, there's a supply constraint challenge. When the Rocky Mountain Institute looked at the total supply of potential for renewable natural gas in the country, they found that that supply was less than the total demand for total demand for natural gas in California by itself. So I think there's also the anticipation that a lot of industry groups are going to be looking towards renewable natural gas as Dominion is looking to clean its grid. It is looking at starting to bring in renewable natural gas to reduce the amount of fracked gas that they're using as one of their strategies. Renewable natural gas is more of an expensive fuel source, and depending on just following the principles of economics of supply and demand, if there is significantly greater demand than there is supply, that would also increase the price and push that up. When you come to gasoline and diesel, the renewable energy examples for that are if you can then switch the vehicle to being powered when using an electric engine. In that case, there are two sort of fuel sources for that would be either a grid provided electricity that charges a battery or a hydrogen fuel cell that then would actually go on the vehicle as well. Offsets by themselves are not exactly renewables. But I think there is a policy question that relates into these topics here. And so I wanted to at least bring the topic up in the context of these other pieces. Not all offsets are the same. Some offsets are produced by like wind farms. Some are tied directly to sequestration practices. So planting mangroves or seagrass, for example. If a utility is then purchasing offsets at an equal amount to the energy that they are providing to you, in effect, they have made, particularly if it's a sequestration offset, they have made what they are supplying to their customers then carbon neutral. So it's not exactly renewable energy, but it does get at that carbon neutrality piece. And I think within this planning process, there is a conversation to be had as to are offsets something that Charlottesville as a whole wants to pursue? And does it matter what type of offsets are being looked at? To what extent are offsets, if they are on the table, to what extent are they an acceptable part of our policy of how we are approaching reaching our 2030 goal for emission reductions, and then getting to that carbon neutrality point for 2050. Bringing back up the scenario slide that I had shared with the stationary energy section, or sorry, stationary sources of emissions section. The orange boxes in this slide are now focusing on what the on-site renewables would be for these three scenarios. A couple of things that I wanted to point out in this is if you look at the difference between scenario 2 and 3, where with scenario 2, it is 15% of the electricity, that's the emissions from electricity would be reduced by on-site renewables versus the 30% in scenario 3. If you look at the number of buildings that this would mean that we need to install solar on, it's a 10-fold difference to double the amount of emission reduction. That is a result of the presumption in these scenarios is that we are going to start by installing solar on the largest buildings and working our way down to the smallest buildings. So as we try to get that additional 16 to 30% reduction, we're working with smaller and smaller buildings, which means the number of solar projects, the number of property owners, the number of contracts, all of that, we need more of those to achieve the same amount of emission reduction. And what that ends up looking like is a 10-fold increase for that. In terms of number of yearly projects, similarly, it's looking at 15%, we're looking at 56. Looking over at comparing that to the 20%, it's a threefold increase in terms of number of projects in order to get that additional 5%. Also, if you look at what those modeled costs are, it's a pretty significant amount of funding that is needed for these. And when you compare that to what the cost is for the energy efficiency, what we've heard in many other spaces, including from at the state and from previous work that's been done in Charlottesville, the cost of emissions saved from energy efficiency projects, it's a cheaper or a less expensive way to achieve those reductions. There are different challenges that come in place in terms of how many occupants you're interacting with, what are the actual process of disruption within the property to be able to do those additions and implementation. And depending on how much efficiency gain you can get inside the building versus sometimes putting a solar system, you get a large chunk all at once. So there's a different pace and scale, a different level of complication of the actual process of what does it take and what does it mean to add any of these strategies onto a building that all play into these questions of what are we targeting? Where do we want to set these targets? For example, of how much energy efficiency reduction do we want to be aiming to achieve in the next 8 to 9 years? How much on-site renewables do we want to be aiming at? And then what does that mean in terms of that context of how many property owners are we aiming to work with on this? Or what does that mean in terms of level of investment that needs to be identified either through energy savings, so it's not new funding, or is it new funding that needs to come into our community either as grants or as money that gets paid back in some fashion to cover those upfront costs? In terms of other strategy considerations, there is that piece of on-site installations versus off-site versus, as a policy question, if Dominion is supposed to make its electricity carbon-free or carbon neutral by 2050, should we just wait for Dominion on the electricity side and focus all of our climate action efforts on the pieces that are not electric right now, and either converting those over to electric or figuring out other options to make those carbon neutral? There are the differences if you're looking at on-site installations versus off-site. For a lot of the off-site situations that are available, like a virtual power purchase agreement, those need to have a certain scale of purchasing power in order to even participate in those actions. And then you look at the size of buildings in Charlottesville, not just small individual homes, but if you look at small business footprints, that scale might not be there. And so in that case, what are those other avenues or options that could be put together to try to bring some of these resources, or does that define which type of strategies we're then pursuing? Again, the question around new construction and new housing, or can we build those so that it makes it easier to add solar and energy storage later if those cannot be part of the initial build out for that? How do we balance these lifetime savings over the upfront costs for it? The split incentive question comes in again, particularly if you're looking at like an apartment building where you can put rooftop solar, but then the individual accounts are distributed across a number of different apartments. There was some legislation this past General Assembly that could make that part easier to tackle, but that still needs someone to do the kind of first project and work out the kinks of, well, what does that actually look like in terms of contracts? There's the idea of that cost of efficiency versus renewables, and where do we want to be trying to direct resources that we can bring in? The questions around resilience, adaptation, and quality of life come in on this again. And I spoke about several of these other kind of policy priority questions. Do we want to focus on where that largest generation potential is, or do we want a broader level of impact by working with smaller properties? Or are we trying to aim for the largest impact on the percent of household income? what are those values and priorities for Charlottesville in terms of how we want to deliver these climate actions on greenhouse gas reductions. Similarly, when we talk about natural gas provision, unlike Dominion, which is a private investor-owned utility, Charlottesville has a natural gas utility. And so it changes the conversation in terms of there's an opportunity to have those conversations around what does natural gas provision in this context look like? And looking at renewable natural gas, is that a route that we want to go? What are the other goals that have been committed to by regional people, regional organizations, within the county and within University of Virginia that are in that business service territory for Charlottesville Gas? And what does that mean, and what are their needs and wants as that relates over to some of these other business decisions for natural gas provision? And additionally, there's looking at what are the current, upcoming, and future funding. There's the ongoing funding programs. These were many of these were the same as what were available looking at the stationary source emissions. Other potentials, similarly, there's things on there. The power purchase agreement, which works for on-site one, helps to marry that challenge of the upfront cost versus paying out of future savings or energy expenditures that you were going to be paying to your utility company. You're now paying for the solar panels to pay that off. And then virtual power purchase agreements, where it's an off-site location. The way the funding structure works is different, but it essentially ends up meaning that you get all of those environmental attributes for the renewable energy electricity that was generated. For both of those, though, that having a big enough amount of purchasing power, seems to be a minimum threshold that you need in order to participate in those contracts. And when we're looking at Charlottesville's smaller buildings, they don't meet that energy threshold right now. So if we're going to be focusing on how do we bring these improvements or bring renewable energy to those types of properties, we're going to need to look at some other structures. So as we move into our discussion, I just wanted to also put these questions back out there for your consideration around what makes greenhouse gas emission actions actionable for Charlottesville specifically. What are barriers that need to be addressed? How do we make this plan equitable? And then, what really is the focus that we're trying to target with, with any sort of policies or to try to address these barriers? Is it a policy need? Is it engagement, funding, regulation, workforce, or something else? And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lasheen for maybe just 2 questions if we can for this section, and then we'll go into transportation. I want to make sure we don't end up having to cut that section too short. But we will also have questions after the transportation piece, and then there will be follow-up opportunities for you all to provide further questions or comments back to us after this workshop.
Sounds good. So the first question we have is from Robin.
Thank you again. This is amazing information. So, but here's how I look at a smaller scale type of situation where my neighbors, my friends, the plumbers, the HVAC workers, people are not in tune with all the benefits of putting up solar and how much you can proceed in becoming an engineer and all that stuff in 2 years. So now, right now, PVC, for instance, because of the CARES Act, is free tuition. So my idea, and this is, I'm sure you considered this, but I mean, if you first of all advertise, schools, even if it's private schools, that teach how to install and then, exceed into becoming an engineer and that sort of thing. And that tuition is actually a way of making money. And then also the other question is zones for roads. When people build, why, I know there's a Dillon law and all that, but why don't we have zoning for when you build, you have to from now on be energy efficient. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. So I think the first question that you're asking about was you really like that, or seemed to speak to your observation that people who work in the space of HVAC companies, or neighbors, I knew that they're not really in tune with what the benefits are of these practices. In addition, that there is workforce needs and it sounds like good job pathways for people. And so sounds like that might also be something that we could follow up with our economic development office to see what they have around workforce development programs, and maybe there is some education engagement with particular stakeholders on in terms of what those workforce pathways and training needs are for our community. Specifically when you're talking about zoning, the state does set the building code, and localities cannot require anything above and beyond what that is for the buildings. So when you're talking about new construction, as by right construction properties, there is what the state building code is. The state building code is adopted. The process is based off of the International Building Code, and the state can make amendments when it makes those adoptions. Many of the amendments have reduced the energy performance, and so what the state has as its building code in regards to aspects that affect energy use is lower in terms of its quality of standards than what the International Building Code has. There are processes at which the state updates its code. I believe it's every 3 years. And that is something that Charlottesville has not, from the climate side, participated in previously. There are some of the industry groups and associations that we're part of who have been engaging in that front. One of the questions that I have, though, is when we're looking beyond just what the by right is. And I think this may be one of the things for the city's zoning update, is that if somebody is applying for a zoning change, whether it's like a planned unit development or special use permit, or to change their zoning status, there can be certain criteria that they have to address in their application that then is used to be evaluated by the Planning Commission and by City Council as to whether or not they're going to grant that zoning change. And there's, I think, the potential to look at that further in this plan process and look at, if Charlottesville adopted a recommended build to standard for energy, getting a better understanding of is even just establishing what our wants is as a recommended standard useful and useful to the building community. Additionally, are there opportunities for us to integrate such a thing into what the zoning update is? Or if the city is investing in building, housing, or other construction projects, can those building standards be attached as conditions to that funding? Those are just a couple of ideas I think we can explore through this process, but I am also open to hearing other ideas that people have for how to tackle that.
So in the space of time, so we can kind of keep on track, Susan, if you want to continue, there will be other opportunities to ask questions, like Susan mentioned, after transportation at the end. So we will continue on with the presentation, then you can ask questions at those points.
All right, thank you. All right, so for our last part, we are going to be talking about transportation. For anyone who has joined us either on the recording or who has tuned in for this last section of our live workshop, I did also want to mention that we do have a web page set up on the city's website, charlottesville.gov/climateplan. That's where we will be posting the recording of the workshop, other materials that we put out for informing this process, future event information, as well as a contact form. And I do encourage everybody to sign up for the Climate Action news flashes. Every time we put something new on the website, we will be pushing out a news flash to let people know that there is new information online and updates about this process. You can sign up for that at charlottesville.gov/notify me or from the URL that is on the screen. All right, moving on to transportation. So what are transportation emission sources? Transportation emission sources represent the ways that we are traveling around Charlottesville that use fuels that produce greenhouse gas emissions. So if you are not if you're moving yourself around and traveling around town in a way that is not producing emissions, it will not be represented in our greenhouse gas inventory profile. So if you are pedaling your own bike or you are walking, that is not data that we are able to collect and represent in the profile. What we do have in our greenhouse gas emission profile is based on data from the Virginia Department of Transportation. They do different count data for jurisdictions across the Commonwealth, and they post those reports on their website. And the data that we are using from that is the vehicle miles traveled and the vehicle types that they count on the roads in the city. Keep in mind, the city we have a lot of transportation back and forth with the county, but also we are part of a larger population and employment center for the surrounding counties as well. So the data that is being calculated and counted looks beyond what is happening regionally in terms of activity, not just city residents in the city vehicle or in vehicles that are registered within the city jurisdiction. Those two pieces of data from VDOT do end up getting combined with then industry and national averages around the fuel types and the miles per gallon for the different vehicle types that were counted by VDOT. In looking at our greenhouse gas emission calculation again, when we're talking about the transportation sector, we're looking at that activity data and the carbon intensity pieces for that. So what that ends up looking like in the context of transportation, reducing induced demand means like reducing that need for the trip. So potentially something like making a phone call rather than going somewhere in person, or teleworking. All of that it reduces that need to actually have to make the trip. Making the trip more direct. So this really speaks to what our street and rail connections are. If you think about the network and the landform that goes with suburban developments, one of the common examples is that as the crow flies, you might be, half a mile away from where you want to get to your destination. But the only access pathways you have to actually get there mean that you essentially have to travel 4 sides of a square in order to get there, because the most direct path, you don't have connections. And so as we look at what our street and trail connections are there ways that we can make those travel patterns to reduce the need for the extensive travel patterns? Looking at reducing the need for single occupancy vehicle use. What are the options for that so that people are not relying on having to get in a vehicle and drive by themselves? Looking at increased equipment efficiency. So this goes to the idea of the better fuel economy standards. Can we get more vehicles on the roads that have higher miles per gallon to it? Looking at your conservation behavior. So the idea of combining your trips or daisy chaining them. If you're going to a shopping center for your food shopping, is there also something at a store there that you can pick up at that same trip rather than having to make a different trip later on within the next week or month? And also this idea of more passenger trips per gallon. This could be something like carpooling. It could also be something like increasing transit ridership and getting more increased use of the transit buses that are going around. And I put the per gallon in quotation marks because depending on what your fuel source is for your vehicle, you might not actually be using gallons of fuel. You might be using kilowatt hours instead. And then in terms of the fuel switching part of the equation, so that middle part and that carbon intensity aspect, it's looking at switching, from gasoline and diesel over to something that is electric. Looking at getting, switching over to a different type of mode transportation. So instead of driving, looking at walking or biking, or even if you go over to, for example, if you switch to an e-bike, you're doing both your fuel switching in terms of the fuel source, but also you're doing that equipment piece of it. One other example that often gets talked about when we're looking at reducing emissions is on the idea of reducing idling. And that can either be people sitting in a parking lot waiting for someone to come out of the store and they're sitting with their engine idling. This also comes up in the context of having congestion and reducing congestion so that while we're driving around town, there's less idling needed just as we're moving along on the roadways. Idling is one of the things that, in terms of the data, we don't have available data that can calculate what that impact is on our greenhouse gas emissions. So I referenced this earlier in a different section, but this is one example where logically we know that is a contributing factor to fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions in our community, but it isn't something that we have data to be able to track. That means if this is something that the community wants to have as part of our climate action plan, there is space in the plan to have things like this. But in terms of making sure that we reach our 2030 reduction goal, that type of activity is not something that we have a way to track and account for. Similarly, with the other sectors we talked about, there's a variety of other strategy considerations that come into play when we're looking at how do we design and how do we choose which strategy we want to pursue in order to deliver these greenhouse gas reductions. So looking at that nexus between land use, transportation, and natural resources planning, where are we locating our residences and our commercial areas? How are those intersected or not to either require travel around town or decrease the need for travel around town? How are we stacking that density in relation to our transportation networks in terms of being able to make that connectivity easier or make it easier for people to take transit, for example, and increase that accessibility? And as we're looking at layering both like where our land use and transportation pieces are and how those pieces intersect and can leverage each other, there's also the question of, well, where are we planning for our natural resources? And are we overlaying our natural resources on these connectivity paths so that it's more comfortable for people to bike or walk around, for example, or wait for the bus? But also, what does that mean in terms of urban heat islands and being able to shade our buildings so they don't need as much energy to maintain a cool temperature in the summer times, but overall, just the overall heat of our urban areas. As we look at climate change and the different agricultural growing zones changing and moving northward up the United States, there's also the question about species migration and maintaining these natural resource access paths for that to occur. One of our core topic teams is going to be focusing on the nexus of these three pieces and the planning opportunities of how we can make sure that climate change is part of this and how we can bring these questions around greenhouse gas emissions and also adaptation into the planning conversations of land use, transportation, and natural resources together. Looking at the questions related to new construction and housing. There's that piece around the street networks and the connections, looking at how we're designing streets, looking at, well, right now, electric vehicles are not affordable for the majority of individuals in our city. When we look at the projections from manufacturers over the next 5 to 10 years, they will become the predominant type of personal vehicle that is available for sale. And so then that's going to start to trickle into our resale market. And so when we're looking at new construction and buildings that are going to be in place for 30, 50, 60 years, there's a question about, is there anything that we can do at the point of construction to make them EV ready so that when that resale market picks up, it is the fact of how the building is built and the lack or the challenges to installing EV chargers at that point can be more manageable. They wouldn't be as costly and would not cause as much disruption for building occupants and construction needs to then be able to install chargers later. The other piece that goes into that is that we do have a 60% rental rate. And so even the question of, do our residents have assigned parking places that they could reliably have a charger for their vehicles? And if they can't have charging in places where they park for their residences, what does that mean in terms of needing to make publicly accessible charger networks available? Additionally, that question around parking access, it's not just for EVs, but also looking at if we want to encourage bicycle usage, are there safe places for bicycles to be stored? Is that even a part of how buildings and bike parking is being provided? looking at that question about lifetime savings versus the upfront costs for things, especially any sort of new technology, and EVs fit into this as well. The cost for powering your EV on an e-gallon is put out, actually the U.S. Department of Energy tracks that nationally and by state. And I've been looking at it on and off for about the last 8 years. And the e-gallon is about a third of the cost of what a gasoline gallon would be. So that's the amount of expenditure to purchase the energy to get the vehicle to move the same distance, whether you're purchasing electricity or you're purchasing gasoline for it. That idea again of the split incentive on, who's in controlling which piece of the property and who's getting that benefit. How does that play into our larger construction? The questions around resilience, adaptation, and quality of life benefits that come from having access to these different transportation options. And policy priorities and those different levers and trade-offs. Looking ahead at what I spoke about before, the EV market and building new housing now. What are building standards or options that we want to encourage being put into place? Looking at funding support for EVs and charging installations, particularly if we are looking at a need to provide public charging because we don't see that being available for residents currently as renters or over time, depending on how land use and housing developments develop. And then looking at the idea of zoning density and ridership for transit ridership, needing to make sure the systems work for current users. But if we want to be able to increase that ridership and increase really the effectiveness of transit so people are using transit more, there's an eye of looking at targeting future users to be able to use transit too. And then always and forever, the current, upcoming, and potential funding routes, and what are the options in that space. There are some ongoing funding programs that are provided and available within the city. Some of these are provided by the city. Some of these are provided by the utilities or things that are being funded out of the state at either individual city properties or the city itself has been a partner with. The DME has been a recipient of a federal grant for extending public EV charging in different parts across the Commonwealth, and Charlottesville is one of the grant partners on that. So we'll be seeing some activities with that grant funding over the next couple of years as that grant project gets put in place and moves forward. Other potentials that come into place on this, the commercial pace, some of this development on a property that then support transportation can be rolled into larger PACE projects. There's something called the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is known kind of informally as the RGGI for transportation. Currently, Virginia is not participating in the cap and trade program for that piece of it. It needs General Assembly approval in order to enact that. If it is enacted, similarly to how RGGI is providing funding for energy efficiency and the caveat of TBD, maybe something supporting renewables or energy storage, the Transportation Climate Initiative would start putting funding towards these transportation improvements so that we can see that across the Commonwealth and make these transportation efforts more affordable. There's going back into that part of the environmental bonds, environmental social governance investing, looking at, as the city is doing its zoning update, what are opportunities within that to start looking at how we can reduce transportation emissions with that part of the planning and zoning piece of it. And then looking regionally at what are other planning processes. A lot of transportation planning for Charlottesville, it actually happens in more of a regional context. And so working with our regional partners who have also made climate commitments to look at, well, how does that inform these more regional transportation planning initiatives? And, going back as we lead into our discussion and question and answer piece, asking, layering onto this, these questions of, for these greenhouse gas emission actions, what makes those actionable? What specific barriers need to be addressed in order for these choices and these travel patterns to be possible for our community and actually like choices that they want to take, not things that, are kind of because they have to take those. How do we make this plan equitable in terms of where we're focusing strategies or what efforts we're focusing on prioritizing? And then looking at what are the policy needs or engagement needs, funding needs, regulation, workforce needs in order to move these pieces forward and make sure that as individuals in our community want to take action in these ways to reduce emissions, that they are supported and able to do so. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lasheen. This is our final discussion and question and answer section. And go ahead, Lasheen, I'll take it away.
Perfect. So the first person we have is Robin Hoffman. Again, if you want to ask any questions at this time, just make sure you go ahead and hit the raise hand option on your screen and I'll bring you into the webinar. But first up is Robin Hoffman.
Thank you very much. Your presentation is amazing, and it's, conjuring up all these things that I looked at in Zoom for the last 9 months. I've been participating in all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so what I found out was the disconnect between DOT, DOA, and DOJ and our local planning boards, and then our local architectural boards. So everyone who has a piece in, zoning or approving roadage or, highway, whatever. When I would get into the Zoom conversation, I would ask them, if you're going to do something on Long Street, whole bunch of building, how are we going to get across from 250? Or if you're doing things in Pantops, etc. And the architectural board said, well, we just approved the building. And then the planning, but so anyway, and then DOT, absolutely takes forever to get roads changed. So that's a big issue. And I was wondering how you looked at that. And then the second thing is Sun Tribe has been doing canopies for parking lots. And I suggested they do that with the school system so that instead of putting it on buildings, the canopies can be retrofitted for the space, and then the buildings can be built and additions put on without having to uninstall all the solar. But what's happened is that since I suggested that, it's almost 2 years ago now, it's so much cheaper now to do those canopies. And I was wondering if you know anything about that. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin. So yeah, I think what you spotted with the disconnect of what the charge for different groups is of what their review perspective and purview is. Yeah, I think we see that in a lot of other places besides just this context of if you're looking at the building versus if you're looking at how it fits into the different neighborhood or the broader community, and who really has the decision-making power, responsibility around those pieces of it. If you look over at the different LEED rating systems, when you look at the different types of certifications from LEED that can be granted, you'll see also that gradation that some are targeted at different levels of kind of, how narrowly in or how granular in you put your viewfinder. Are you looking at the 50,000 foot view or the 10,000 foot view or like the 5 foot view? So my hope is that in our core topic team on that transportation, land use, and natural resources piece, we'll be able to get to the point of discussing and identifying what some of these key nexus pieces are that can then be incorporated in our climate action plan and be brought into these other conversations so that it has that public process that has vetted and defined and refined into what are these stances of priorities that need to be looked at across these different areas. In terms of the parking lot canopies, that is a really good point to bring that up. And I think, as you said, like costs on solar market in general have been coming down. And several years ago, the cost of adding the additional structure that then has to support the canopy does make it more expensive than on a rooftop usually. But those are possible as that can be wrapped into a work scope for something like PPA. I know specifically Sun Tribe had taken a look at the Charlottesville High School parking lot. And, at kind of first blush, it's this big open parking lot. So it seems like it would be great for a parking lot solar canopy. And then they discovered that actually the Dominion transmission power lines that run near that property actually put this little crisscross grid of shade across the entire parking lot, to the extent that it would pretty much make it not worth, or that not pretty much, it would make it not worth putting solar there, because we wouldn't get the generation out of the solar panels due to that constant little tiny bits of shade crisscrossing it. Yeah.
Oh my
I know. It's one of those things where like, oh, that'd be oh, no, it's not perfect. And that's one, I think, the challenge is that, even with the scenario numbers I put up from the first two pieces, I'm looking at the stationary sources and renewables, is, little tiny pieces like that of like what those little parts of site context are, end up having pretty dramatic, or can have dramatic effects in terms of what we're able to do or not do. And so if we're looking also at new construction where you can orient the roof surface or look at where you're placing your rooftop equipment to be able to maximize the potential for solar, those are design considerations that the earlier those are brought into a building design process, the more opportunities it creates down the road, and potentially with no additional costs. It's just making clear that when you're first planning and drawing something out, that's part of the consideration of where you place things.
Thank you.
So the next
Thank you.
person we have is Leslie. Leslie, can you hear us? Hello, Leslie? Leslie, can you hear us?
She was on before.
She was. Let me try to take her out and then bring her back in.
Also,
Leslie,
I don't know
can
if
you-
anyone. Go ahead.
Leslie, if you can't hear us or we can't hear you, can you try typing your question in the chat box? While we wait to see if we're able to get Leslie's question, if anybody else want to raise their hand at this time and ask a question, go ahead and do so at this time. So Susan, it doesn't look like anyone else is raising their hand. I'm hoping that Leslie will be able to send us a chat with a question.
Okay. Well, sorry, one of the things I had seen really quickly on the subtitles was when the last time I said thank you before we were then trying to bring Leslie in, somehow the subtitles translated that in as typing kill, which I don't quite know how it got there or it got to that point of interpretation, but I hope the rest of the subtitles went okay for people today. Well, in conclusion, if we don't have any other questions, we will be having the recording for the workshop posted online. Mostly we did keep pretty well to those time points, so that should get you, if you want to hop back into a certain piece of the conversation, you can use those to do that. And we will be posting follow-up question material. So if you have other questions that you didn't necessarily want to ask in this open forum or something that occurs to you afterwards, we do want to hear from you, so please do send those in. And just as a final reminder, we do have the climate plan webpage on the city's website, which is where we are going to be putting all the information related to our climate action plan. And we will be announcing through our news splashes, and we have new resources, tools, things like that available. So please do sign up for those to get that email or text notification. You can either access it through the URL that's on the screen right now, or at charlottesville.gov/notify-me. So thank you all very much for spending the last 2 hours with us. I appreciate your questions and your engagement. it really is important to have that and that dialogue as part of developing the climate action plan. And I look forward to continuing these conversations with you all and moving this process forward.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.